located both on the park side this way and at JFK Street on that side. In case of an emergency, walk to the exit closest to you and congregate in the JFK Park. Please also take a moment now to silence your cell phones. You can join the conversation online with the hashtag JFK Junior Forum Live and interact with our student-run Instagram at JFK Junior Forum for behind-the-scenes highlights. Please now take your seats and join me in welcoming our guests. First, we have author and journalist Stephen Greenhouse. Second, president of the Association of Flight Attendants-CWA, Sara Nelson, and moderator Katie Johnston of the Boston Globe. Thank you so much.
In the last 2 years, it's really gained a lot of momentum. I think there's been close to 1 million workers on strike over 2 years, which is the highest in 35 years, I think, the average. A lot of young people and professionals are getting into unions, and so, numbers are declining. There is some energy out there. And I just wonder what you guys make of that. What's going on? Are people just fed up and not worried about losing their jobs? Or is there really a renewed belief in the power of organizing?
I think it's both. So, I wrote this book that really looked at the decline of worker power in America and how that has hurt, workers, has hurt our economy, has hurt purchasing power, has hurt our political system by allowing, corporations and the Koch brothers to have so much control. And, I write about how this decline in worker power has led to decades of income stagnation has fueled income inequality, and I think a lot of workers saw that we're in 10 years, 11 years into this economic recovery. Until recently, Wall Street was at stock market was at record levels, corporate profits are at record levels, and all these workers are saying, I'm not feeling anything in my pocketbook. Wages aren't going up. I see all these great ads to buy Mercedes-Benz and BMWs. I can't begin to afford that. And, all these teachers who began this real wave of strikes, the teachers in West Virginia, they were averaging $44,000 a year, 48th in the nation. The governor said, we're just going to give you a raise of 1% a year for the next 5 years. And they thought, this is crazy. The state government is giving tax cuts to business, to the rich, and so the teachers in West Virginia, Oklahoma, Arizona, the GM strikers, the Marriott hotel strikers, some grad students, are just fed up that they feel that their wages are not keeping up, and because the unemployment rate is so low, I think people feel emboldened that it's going to be harder for management to replace them when they go on strike.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. People are feeling exploited, and I think if you take the teachers in West Virginia, for example, in those communities had been hurt in many different ways, but because there had been such a job loss and such a driver of inequality, then the tax base decreased and the schools were eroding, and so what actually happened was that there was a real feeling of solidarity in that strike, not just among the teachers, all the school personnel, but also the school administrators in each of the counties who were trying to make ends meet. So this was really about recognizing that what was happening with the teachers was also really about fighting for the entire community, mm-hmm. and fighting for lifting up the entire community. And so what we've seen actually across industries is that the eroding of work, the contracting out, trying to lessen the definition of an employee, the the lower staffing, people having to do more with less, people having the wages being essentially stagnant while productivity is going through the roof. The scheduling so that people don't have control of their own lives. And in some cases, businesses are scheduling people to get them out of having benefits. Even where unions have been able to be successful in bargaining healthcare, every time they're going to the table, the healthcare is being diminished. So these are common trends across both public and private now. And people are starting to feel the solidarity because they're starting to feel a common experience together. Mm-hmm. And it can't just be put into different classes or different job classifications anymore. There is a commonality between a flight attendant and a pilot and a hotel worker, or a postal worker who's trying to hang on to their pension and health care and an attempt to privatize the postal service. And so there is this commonality of experience, and people are talking with each other and experiencing it in their communities, and that has been supercharged by globalization as well. Mm-hmm. And by lopsided trade deals. I mean, I take, for example, a lot of people think that, NAFTA was all about hurting manufacturing. Well, I can tell you that we had a flight attendant base of 4,000 in Pittsburgh, and it is no longer there. So this commonality of experience is really building this solidarity that's having people stand up for each other and get back to the basic principles without even necessarily understanding what it is about an injury to one is an injury to all, and we've got to have each other's backs.
And if I may just add. So I think, though we might not like to admit it, a lot of workers, blue-collar workers, voted for Donald Trump because they thought the system was rigged, and he promised to unrig it. And people waited a year or two, and they saw he was not unrigging the system, he was further rigging the system. I think a lot of workers thought, things are not, we voted for this guy, he's not making things better for workers, his Supreme Court's voting against workers, and NLRB is making it harder to unionize, his Labor Department is making all these decisions against workers. So I think they felt we have to do something ourselves. We have to take power into our own hands. And as Sara was saying, the West Virginia teacher strike was a huge success. It really kind of woke up workers across the nation to, the possibilities of a strike. And it really spread, to Oklahoma, to Arizona, to Los Angeles. I think without those strikes, we would not have seen the Marriott strike. We would not have seen the General Motors strike. And I think each successful strike, and there have been a lot, helps beget other strikes.
Right. And there's definitely a lot more support out there. Like you were saying, when I was covering the Marriott strike, one of the labor leaders said there's more people are coming by and just saying, we support you, we're with you, like non-union people, than he said he'd ever seen before in his decades of organizing. So I think that's very powerful to have that support. Well, I wonder what you guys think unions can do to capitalize on this. Are they capitalizing it? Are they doing enough? And what can they do to kind of take this momentum and make things better?
So we have to organize in the millions. We can't organize just in the hundreds anymore. And the way to do that, in my view, is to really take on the issue of sexism and racism and any sort of discrimination. Because what's really necessary is to help people understand this is a place, unions are a place where we can come together and make things better together. And if we don't, I'll give you an example. A month ago, I was reading an article from the Northwest, and this article was about a couple tech workers, millennials or maybe Gen Z, who were feeling like they were getting exploited in the workplace and wanted to do something about it. And one of them had heard, well, there's this thing called a union that's supposed to help, but I don't know what that is. So she actually Googled the word union to try to figure it out. And then another one said, yeah, I think I've got to get a union in my workplace. I heard that my neighbor is a union organizer, so I'm going to go knock on her door. There was actually a house call to the union organizer to ask about the union, what they could do. So the situation is ripe. We're going to have to, as unions, we are going to have to supercharge the 13 million who are already in unions. We've got to reject any sort of narrative that union members are going to be harmed by non-union members. We have got to be out there and get back to the fact that union members are on the forefront of trying to make things better for everyone, for all working people. And I think if we do that and we help people understand that you can build a union that is meaningful to you, we're seeing a lot in the media sector organizing, and it's very interesting because they're organizing under one union, but in each case they're giving the name of their union in their workplace. And it's really important to have the workers own their union. And if we can get that message out there and we can support that and we can actually invest in organizing rather than just in politics, because today, especially, I'm just going to say, feeling a little battered from last night, that politicians are not going to save us. They can't save us. And so this is not about one election. The labor movement is forever. And so if we really understand that, and we can understand that saving our democracy is about building up labor unions and organizing and talking about the wins in these strikes, the reason that we've seen candidates out on picket lines this past year is because people are seeing that you can actually get results by standing together, sometimes in a day, sometimes in a week. Sometimes you just got to stick with it, like the Harvard grad students who need to keep together. But we can get results, and we can take this into our own hands. And the only reason that we have anything good in this country is because working people have come together and demanded it. Sometimes they've done that in a chaotic way with wildcat strikes or mass strikes. And we don't talk about that history all the time. But what we can do as a labor movement with 13 million people and the power of the labor movement that still exists is to tell that history and to give people a narrative about what they can do to supercharge that now. Inject also a real mandate to fight sexism and racism and organize in the millions.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to chime in again, sorry. So in ways, unions face two big challenges now. There have been these successful strikes, and I think that's really awakened a lot of workers to that unions can kick ass, unions can do a lot of good, especially on striking. When they really band together, they can win against management. So that, one of the big challenges is that how do you translate that into unionizing tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, good luck on millions. We're seeing a lot more organizing, especially among young workers, adjunct professors, grad students in my field, digital media, the LA Times, the Chicago Tribune, Kickstarter just unionized. We've read about some incipient efforts at Google. Google's fired 4 workers who, great Google, saintly Google supposedly, has fired four worker activists. So there's a lot bubbling up, I think partly because of the successes of the strikes. The latest Gallup poll found that 64% of American workers approve of unions. That's nearly the highest level in 50 years. Some folks across the way in Cambridge and MIT did a study saying that 1 in 2 non-union workers say they'd like to join a union tomorrow if they could. That's up from 32% 25 years ago. So a lot of people are interested in unions, but the other big challenge is that corporate America fights extremely, extremely hard against unionization efforts, and the playing field, as explained loud and clear in my book, is very, very, very tilted against workers in unions when they want to unionize.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, Sara, I wonder what's going on with flight attendants. Can you tell us what the state of unionization is in your profession?
Sure, yeah. So we are 80% organized as flight attendants.
That's amazing.
Imagine if the entire workforce had that kind of density. But
Delta on that, yes.
But Delta Airlines has kept the union off the property. The last time that we had a union election at Delta was in 2010, and the airline coming out of bankruptcy spent $38 million in 6 months during that election to keep the union off the property. Mm-hmm. In doing that, over the last 10 years, they have essentially saved $100 million a year when compared with, say, the same size operation at United, where we have this union contract. And so you can see very quickly why they would spend the $38 million to keep the union off the property. But flight attendants organized almost 70 years ago, really to beat back discriminatory practices that made us quit when we hit age 32, if we got married or had a child, if we got a little too tight in our uniform. We had to step on a weight scale until 1993. Oh my God. We often say that we fought for men to have the same rights on the job as women. You're welcome, guys. And so so flight attendants really carved out this career from what was intended to be a job and was really a position that was objectified and sexualized. And so in the past couple years, actually, with the Me Too movement breaking, we absolutely were on the forefront of calling for addressing these issues in the workplace, addressing sexual harassment, sexual assault. And it was interesting because we did a survey of our members. 68% said that they had experienced sexual harassment and assault. 20% said they had experienced physical sexual harassment in the past year alone. But we were hearing stories from flight attendants, and mostly women were telling their stories. And I have to tell you that when I have been on the plane, I have seen men be objectified and experience sexual harassment because our jobs are objectified, and so people have been taught to believe that they can treat us a certain way. And I asked the men, why aren't you speaking up? Why aren't you telling your stories? And they all said to me, maybe in a little bit different way, but the same sort of way, they said, Sara, they said, we work in a workplace where 80% of our coworkers are women. And if we're ever going to have any real bargaining power, we have to make sure that women have equal standing at the table. Otherwise, we're never going to be able to push our careers forward. And I think that that is a real insight into the way that we need to be thinking about addressing inequality, economic inequality, because you're not going to have half of the leadership skills, you're not going to have half of the innovation skills if you're not addressing issues in the workplace and inviting all workers to come in. But as workers also, you're not going to have the bargaining power to move this forward if you have some people in your workplace who are thought of as less than others. You just simply don't have the same bargaining power at the table. So if there's people who come to this with a certain privilege because of where they've come from and what their experience has been in life, it's a real eye-opening experience to understand that someone else in your workplace, if they are discriminated against, that actually is ultimately harming you. And in our union halls, we can have those sort of discussions because this is not a self-selecting process. We have all these great social movements and social groups that are trying to push forward on issues that people care about in the communities, but they're all self-selecting, so they hit a level of plurality around those issues and can't push forward anymore. Through labor unions, we don't have any choice about who we're going to work with. The boss decides, right? And so if you can organize in the workplace and bring people together and have conversations and actually get out and fight for common issues on the job and get out on the picket line, people are talking who otherwise are not talking in this dynamic that we're living in today, where many people are self-selecting where they're living and where they're choosing to go and where they're spending their time in their church or whatever it may be. So the union halls are the one place where you can bring all these different factions together, and have a conversation around common issues that you care about, and actually start to learn about other people and care about them and understand someone else's perspective. And and in a strike, you have to get 90% of the people on board on the same issue. It is not an issue of politics where you get 51%. You have to get 90%. So you are driving to consensus. You're actually driving people to solutions and to coming together, being together. So I really believe the labor movement is about creating better citizenship. It's about understanding what democracy is. It's about engaging people in the democratic process. And it's also about promoting this idea that if there's someone different from you, you don't have to fear them, but you can actually grow a curiosity and ask them to tell their story and understand a little bit better and have a better understanding about the world yourself.
Well, playing off that, as a female leader in the labor movement, you are a rarity. Are you seeing more women rising up through the ranks? Do you think it would make a difference if there were more female labor leaders out there?
I think it makes a huge difference. I think that the biggest thing that came out of this Me Too movement was the idea that women were going to stand up for each other, because we've been told forever that we're in competition with each other. And that's one thing that I was given as a gift when I got to become a part of the flight attendant union. Because in 1946, we negotiated our seniority list, and we said we weren't going to give management the ability to have us compete with each other based on, who was going to give sexual favors in the office, or be encouraged to do that for our schedules, right? We weren't going to give in to the idea that if you are a mature flight attendant, somehow you have less value than if you are someone who is fitting into that uniform still a little bit better, and younger and tighter skin and everything else. So I think that women are going to take control. I mean, we've had it, and we're starting to learn we've got each other's backs. And we're not falling for this idea that we are in competition with each other, but really starting to learn that actually we're gaining power by standing together.
I think we should applaud Sara because she's leading this effort to unionize Delta Airlines, which is 25,000 flight attendants, right?
Yes.
And a lot of union leaders are scared, are very reluctant to take on such an ambitious battle. And you may remember that Delta had these crazy ads, a year ago, saying, why in the world would, flight attendants or Delta workers want to pay union dues? You could use that money to buy tickets to go to football games. Yes, flight attendants. And it's, I have this line in my book that, in no other industrial country do corporations fight so hard to beat back and de-quash unions, and it's really true. It's very hard. There's a study by a professor at Cornell, Kate Bronfenbrenner, that found that 57% of employers facing unionization drives threaten to close operations if the workers vote to unionize. 47% of employers say they're going to cut wages and benefits if the workers unionize. Basically 1 in 5 rank and file union activists get fired when they try to unionize, and it takes years and years of litigation to get them back. So it's really hard. So it's impressive that a union leader, is willing to take on such a challenging effort.
Thanks, Stephen.
Well, getting back to politics, what can Democrats do to capitalize on this? I mean, do you think that the candidates are paying enough attention to workers? Yes, they're getting on the picket lines, but are they making enough promises? Or do you think they're getting through to what workers need?
I covered labor workplace matters for the New York Times for 19 years, and every even-numbered year I go to Ohio, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and write about labor and the campaign. And I hate to say it, but I don't remember Hillary Clinton or John Kerry or Michael Dukakis or Al Gore talking a lot about unions. And I think unions have very much declined. People don't realize that, to my mind, a big reason that Trump won Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania is that unions declined so much there. After Scott Walker pushed through this bill to cripple public sector unions, union membership in Wisconsin has fallen by 44%, by 177,000 in the past decade. Trump won Wisconsin by 22,700 votes. Michigan, because of the right to work bill, because of the crisis in the auto industry, its union membership has dropped 146,000 in the past decade. Trump won Michigan by 10,700 votes. Pennsylvania's lost 180,000 union members. Trump won Pennsylvania by 44,000 votes. So I think a lot of the candidates see, hey, if we as Democrats are going to win these crucial states, and Minnesota might be on the line too, that it's important to help build back unions. And there's a study by some professors at BU and Columbia and Brookings finding that when a right-to-work bill is enacted, the vote share going to Democrats drops by 3.5% compared with non-right-to-work states. So 3.5%. Trump won right-to-work Michigan by 0.2%. Trump won right-to-work Wisconsin by 0.8%. So I think, Tom Perez, former Secretary of Labor, the candidates, they get the importance of unions. And also, of course, the candidates are not stupid, and they see that, there's been all this wage stagnation, all this income inequality, and they want to help workers. And they see that one very important way to do that is to help build up unions again.
Yeah, so I think it's really important that the candidates are recognizing that they can't just tell the old middle class speech. and think that they're going to get the union vote. I mean, first of all, they're talking about something that some people now have never even experienced. What the hell's the middle class, right? I'm working 2 and 3 jobs to try to get by. But also talking about what labor unions did in the past is not paying attention to what's happening now. So I think what's been different about 2020 is, first of all, you've had all this action with labor unions. You've had all these strikes. You've seen the start of a resurgence there. You see people start to tell their stories, but also there seems to be a recognition from these candidates that they can't just talk with a union leader in Washington and really have that translate to votes on the ground. They're going to have to get out there and actually talk with the locals and talk with the workers about what's going on in order to really have that translate into votes. And so it's a little bit like in 2012, I went to the White House for a Women in the Economy Forum, and it was great. It was the first time that the White House had ever held anything like this. But we spent all morning talking about the wage gap, and finally we got into a breakout session, and the moderator said, anybody like to comment? And I raised my hand and I said, well, why did we spend all morning talking about the wage gap when we could have been talking about how we're making it easier for women to join unions? Because if women could join unions and negotiate a union contract, you immediately close the wage gap. If women can join unions and actually sit across from their employer at the bargaining table, they have standing, they have real value in their workplace, and they're able to know exactly what everyone else is making in that workplace, and you have more equality. And so the moderator looked at me and then called on the next person and thanked everyone else. And then when the lights were off and the cameras had been turned off, came over to me and said, oh, I just wanted to thank you so much for your comments. And I said, well, now that everybody's gone, I said, listen, it's really great that we have a president who's not afraid to say the word union. But as long as you're balancing the federal budget off the backs of federal workers by attempting to cut their pensions and their wages, that's not inspirational when unions have to fight so hard to hang on to what we had yesterday. And when we're gone, there's going to be no one here to fight for you. And she said, I hadn't thought of it that way. And so
Wow.
I think that, I think that there is starting to be a recognition in this political cycle that you cannot just think of unions as a constituency and a token nod. You're going to have to do real work, because this is where the real people are, and this is where we actually have the ability to turn our democracy around.
And I was delinquent not adding one thing. So in this campaign, virtually, all the Democratic candidates have issued these elaborate platforms to how to build up unions. Yes, we'd expect that from Bernie Sanders. Yes, we'd expect that from Elizabeth Warren. But Biden has it, and I should add, Sharon Block and Ben Sachs at Harvard Law School have played a big role in helping draft some of these plans. Pete Buttigieg wrote a terrific platform on labor. It's like one of the best things. I recommend it to all young people, saying this is a great primer to understand how young workers are being screwed nowadays and the advantages of unions. And Beto O'Rourke had a great labor platform. Amy did. It's a real difference, and then they're so much more advanced than where Hillary Clinton was 4 years ago. I mean, it's a big difference. I think a lot of the candidates get it. It's hard to know whether it's just window dressing. They're saying to unions, we're doing this, but then Bernie and Elizabeth Warren, of course, have been on picket lines. But Pete Buttigieg now, I got a press release. Even though he's pulled out of the race, he was at a fight for 15 picket lines today. So.
All right, good.
Yeah.
Good.
Well, so let's talk about the bad stuff. The decline in labor unions and worker power. What has this meant for Americans? How has this contributed to, fueled income inequality, political inequality, social inequality? And if we can strengthen unions, how will it move the needle on those things?
So I'll quote former Harvard professor John Kenneth Galbraith, who's said in the 1950s, 60s that unions play a very important role as a countervailing force towards corporations, and they help pressure corporations to share more of their profits and prosperity, and they will tell a federal government to try to get involved to stop this anti-competitive merger, or stop companies from polluting improperly. So unfortunately, as union membership has gone from 35% of the workforce to just 10%, unions are not the countervailing power they were. And I would imagine if unions are far stronger, we'd see, we wouldn't see this big effort to repeal Obamacare. Social Security would be more generous. I imagine, the FTC, the FTC might be more rigorous in enforcing antitrust. I think, and the whole national conversation would focus more on what's good for workers. And then also in politics, in the 2016 election cycle, corporations gave $3.4 billion to candidates, which was 16 times as much as unions, which gave $213 million. So, why, when the public supports an increase in minimum wage by 82% to 19%, they support enacting paid sick days 85% to 14%. That's why Congress does nothing on it, because they're beholden to the corporate donors. One more number I'll throw at you. And in lobbying each year in Washington, corporations spend just under $3 billion, which is about 600 times as much as what unions spend. And that's why these huge tax cuts for corporations get enacted and very little pro-worker stuff is ever enacted.
So I think that it's a little bit of a chicken and an egg on whether or not we have good policy that stops all that gets rid of all the hurdles for people to join unions, and we can actually build up the labor movement and take on inequality and improve conditions for everyone, have better health care for everyone, all of those things. Or are we going to have a situation where labor law continues to be eroded? We have fewer and fewer people who actually even have the right to organize in their workplace because of the definition of their work. And people really have nowhere else to turn, and it becomes very chaotic. I mean, I think it's all encapsulated in Elizabeth Warren's quote, and I'm going to screw it up, about creating the Consumer Protection Agency, when she is talking about either we're going to get this agency or we're going to have a lot of blood and teeth, on the ground. And that's really what it comes down to, is the people who are in charge are going to have to make a risk assessment of, do we have in place good labor law that actually promotes the idea of labor peace and people can join unions and be a part of a whole collective bargain? Or are we going to fight that and continue to erode that and get to a place where there's blood in the streets? And that's really what we're driving to, and what is going to be really the question here.
Well,
Go
ahead.
Sorry. So someone just emailed me today saying, John Ring, Trump's appointee to be chairman of the National Labor Relations Board, was asked at some conference today, and he said, do you really think our role in NLB is to, enforce, protect employee rights? And you look at the preamble of the Great National Labor Relations Act of 1935, which really created federally protected right to unionize and bargain collectively. It says it is the, the role, the principle of the government to help encourage collective bargaining and protect worker rights to bargain to improve their lots. So, the chairman of Trump's NLRB is basically saying, sorry, folks, that's not what we're here for. And if unions were stronger, we wouldn't have a chairman of the NLRB who's doing everything he can to weaken unions. Yeah. We wouldn't have, a labor secretary who was corporate America's top gun, top lawyer in fighting every effort to expand worker rights.
Mm-hmm. But to your question about can unions make it better? I mean, one of the reasons that we have the National Labor Relations Act is because the mine workers were out on strike for 9 months the year before. And you think about that union that was really built up over the course of 30 years, taking it from a miner who was valued less than a donkey, and had to live in company housing and get paid in company script and go to the company doctor, and have total control over their lives, to creating a real middle-class job, safety and health on the job, good health care, pensions that you can count on. That was the union over the course of 30 years, simply bringing together the most exploited work, well, I mean, with the exception of slavery, obviously, but the most exploited labor, and bringing people together who oftentimes actually were immigrants speaking different languages. But when there was a mine disaster, they all had the common experience of having to comfort the kids who didn't have their dad coming home, or the families that no longer had their loved ones. And so there was a commonality there between the workers, because of their common experience, that led them to organize in the worst of conditions, that led them to become the most powerful union in the country, that took action, that really organized millions of other workers. So we've done this before. And also forced this country to put in place labor law that then gave us real labor peace for a very long time, until we forgot that history, and there was an attempt to erode that and take more and more control for corporations, so that we're back in a different cycle here. But one piece of good news, back during that time, this university was also encouraging grad students to go out and be strike breakers, to arm themselves and be strike breakers on one of the great strikes of all time in Lawrence, Massachusetts. And today, grad students are joining together and actually being joined by Boston teachers and SEIU and Unite Here and Teamsters. And so at this university, you're seeing progress by the very people who were essentially tricked into keeping other workers down, and now have become part of the labor movement themselves. So even though we're not all the way to that contract that the grad students deserve, look at the progression that has been made at this school alone with that experience and solidarity. And that's why I have hope today, and that's why I think that we're not just repeating the history of before, but that progress is slow and steady. Change may come fast, but progress is slow and steady. And you can see progress right here at Harvard with the way that people are standing up for each other.
Well, let's talk about the grad workers' struggle here a little bit. Because the path has been a little unusual. They've been negotiating for a long time. They called a strike at the beginning of December, kind of morphed into a virtual picket line over the holidays, and then they called it off abruptly at the end of the year. And but there's no contract that has been reached. And so I just wondered what you make of this structure, and is who if it shows who has the power, or what's going on, because I had never observed a strike in this fashion.
So, Harvard has a lot of power. It's probably
right. Okay,
probably,
we know who has the
probably
power.
the richest university in the nation, if not on earth.
Right.
And I'll praise Harvard because, unlike some universities like the University of Chicago, it agreed to sit down and bargain with the grad students union. And it, unlike many universities, it acknowledges that the work that graduate teaching students do, teaching assistants do, that it's really work. And the NLRB and many universities make believe that the valuable work that graduate teaching assistants do is not work. It's just supposedly part of their studies. And that's, we can call BS on that. And I think it's this fiction where a lot of university administrators, are dishonest and say it's not work. But, so they negotiated a long time. They did not reach a contract. It's hard to, as an outsider, it's hard for me to judge whether Harvard was offering not enough as a raise. But where I think the grad students, make a good argument that Harvard was not really acting in good faith is, on two issues. One, on sexual harassment and race discrimination. Harvard wanted to adjudicate those, handle all that by itself, by its own staff, rather than have a third-party arbitrator do that. And any self-respecting union is not going to agree to, okay, we'll let management resolve that and adjudicate that and decide who gets punished and who doesn't. That's we've seen too many human resources departments bury sexual harassment cases under the rug, and we never hear about that again. So I think Harvard, in insisting in refusing to agree to letting a third-party arbitrator hear those cases is really kind of, kicking the union very hard and basically saying we're not going to agree to a fair contract. Second, again, so there's something called the Union Security Clause, where employers agree that everyone at a unionized workplace, everyone has to pay union dues or union fees to the union. But and that's pretty common in the North and the Midwest in non-right to work states. But Harvard is saying, as I understand it, that the workers should have, the grad students should have the right to opt out of paying anything to the union that represents them, that bargains for them, that fights for raises for them, that handles grievances for them. And when an employer refuses, says it basically supports an open shop, that's really signaling loud and clear to the union that we don't believe in unionism and we want to undermine unionism. And then the other issue is, Trump's National Labor Relations Board, Trump, the supposed friend of workers, has signaled that it wants to take away the right of graduate student teaching assistants and research assistants to unionize and bargain collectively. And there's a feeling that some universities are stalling in negotiations. I'm not saying that's the case for Harvard, but some people will argue it is, that Harvard's trying to run out the clock until the NLRB's proposal new rule takes force. I think it would be great if, even after the NLRB issues this rule that graduate students no longer have a right to unionize, that Harvard continues negotiating to try to reach a real contract and recognize the union. I think Harvard, like universities, like politicians, should realize that things are really way out of whack in our economy, that workers are really taking on the chin, partly because unions are so weak. And I think universities, like politicians, should say we should play a role in society by helping promote and recognize unions as a way to right this very broken ship.
So, so Harvard has produced many union avoidance lawyers, and it's funny because I was here in May to talk about how we pay for a Green New Deal. And when I left the room after I had talked about really the concept that Mother Jones talked about 100 years ago, that the capitalists are always organizing, they never let a good crisis go to waste, right? And
you've read your Naomi Wolf.
And so in this moment where we're looking at climate crisis, what we were talking about is if we're not on top of this and making this a Green New Deal, making this work for all workers, then there are going to be people who profit off of this crisis, and unless we do better. And so I was talking about my experience with that, with the United Airlines bankruptcy on the back end of 9/11, and what we all went through in the wake of that crisis. And when I left that day, I happened to notice that I was in the lecture hall that was called the Kirkland and Ellis Lecture Hall, and it happened to be the law firm that was United's bankruptcy attorneys who, fought us tooth and nail to get rid of our pensions, that I had just been talking about. So I'm very familiar with the carrot and stick union avoidance strategy, and I think the fact that Harvard has come to the table with the union, I'm just going to call it out here. Stephen was being maybe a little more generous, but I'm just going to say that this is a more mature approach to union avoidance because they've been doing it for a very long time and know how to do it well. So when you say that you're going to come to the table with your union, but you're going to promote a right to work clause in the contract, that does not mean that you are devoted to collective bargaining because you want to unravel collective bargaining within the process of collective bargaining. So I'm going to call it out for what it is. And I think that, they think that they can withstand criticism over the fact that they want to remove the issue of sexual harassment and discrimination out of the union contract because they have $40.9 billion to buffer any public outcry around that. I'm just going to say right here and now that that's wrong. And
we'll keep calling it out and standing with the grad students until Harvard actually comes to the table in good faith to negotiate an agreement. I would say that the grad students made Harvard have to call in FMCS, and so there was absolute progress from that strike, and it's just a matter of keeping it up and holding their feet to the fire and making the risk too great to not have to reach an agreement that it will take for Harvard to actually get serious and negotiate that contract. So we'll stick with it, and I would encourage the grad students to stick with it.
Fair enough. All right, so I think we're going to go to questions. If anyone has any, there's a couple microphones, I think. So if you want to just say your name and your affiliation and fire away. Go ahead.
Feldman, I'm an immigration lawyer and a student at the Extension School. Is that not working? It's okay? Okay.
Yeah, you're good.
So my question might seem odd in a certain way. When you talk about working conditions, the nurses a couple of years ago in Massachusetts put a referendum up to try to control how many cases and patients they could be assigned, and it failed miserably. And I was a teacher in New York City for some time, and I never really loved my union bargaining for things like the seniority system and things like that. I thought that I just want to work. If we could bargain, and here was my idea. If we could trade card check that failed under the Obama administration for the ability to get wages and benefits instead of working conditions, would there be any kind of legs for greater unionization over more limited issues of wages and benefits, and not seniority systems and working conditions?
Okay, so Sara touched upon this before. So take the LA teacher strike. So before this, before the teachers went on strike for 6 days, the school district was offering a 6% raise over 2 years, and the teachers were demanding more school nurses, more school librarians, more school counselors, reduction in class sizes, stuff that was really to help the students in the community more than the teachers themselves. Strike for 6 days. They picketed with huge parental and student support, and it kind of poured every single day in Los Angeles during the strike. So at the end of 6 days, they end the strike. What raise did the teachers end up with? 6%. They didn't take anything more than they originally offered, but they won huge gains in the number of librarians, and the number of nurses, the number of school counselors, concrete reductions in class size. And I think when a union does that, it's now called bargaining for the common good, it really helps excite people about working with unions. It excites people about the potential of unions. And and I think unions are increasingly doing that. In the General Motors strike, the very first day of the strike, the lead UAW negotiator for GM said, "We want to be clear, this strike isn't just for us. It's for you. It's for all of America. You don't like it when plants go overseas. Well, we're fighting against plants going to Mexico. The Lordstown plant closed supposedly because there was not enough demand for Chevy Cruises. That plant made Chevy Cruises. Hey, GM's continuing to make Chevy Cruises in Mexico." Terry Dittis, the UAW negotiator with GM, also said that you are also worried about whether there'll be good jobs for your kids and your grandkids. That's one of the big reasons we're striking. The great General Motors, the iconic company, 7% of its factory workers are temps, making only $15 an hour, what many McDonald's workers are making. And they said, we're striking for the common good. It's not just us. The Marriott strike here in Boston and 7 other cities, they said, one of the big reasons for the strike is that too many low-wage workers have to work 2 and 3 jobs. And the motto, which really caught on, was, one job should be enough. So I think unions increasingly get it that they can't just fight for an extra, 0.7% in their paycheck. They have to fight for bigger things to help all of society, because unions are the one institution in society that exists to fight for lower income, middle income, moderate income Americans of all races, women and men, of all nationalities.
Yeah. So, we fought for that seniority list early on because it was about beating back discriminatory practices. And that is the backbone of seniority lists, is really to stop
the corporation from being able to discriminate and being able to give favors to workers who are willing to undercut their fellow colleagues. You know, PATCO was an incredibly strong union. They were mobilized. They fought hard for their members, the air traffic controllers. They had great pay. They had great benefits. And when they had all of that on the table, where they failed was not helping other workers understand that their fight was going to have an impact on the other workers' fight too. When Ronald Reagan fired all of the air traffic controllers, it was a signal to the rest of corporate America to take a hardline stand against unions and to erode the right to strike, and it was a real attack on workers' rights. So we have to be smarter as a labor movement about connecting our fights, and I would also say that there is something real about the dignity of work. So people take great pride in the work that they do. If you talk to a janitor in a hospital, that janitor can tell you exactly how important that work is, and that they take pride in the fact that they are cleaning up for people who are at their most vulnerable points in their life. And if they didn't do that work, and as we have seen cutbacks on that, I don't like going to a hospital today because everybody knows it's more likely that you're going to end up with something worse when you leave the hospital than when you went in. And so the work of our janitors matters. So that's the kind of discussion that we need to be having. The work that our nurses do and the ability to care for their patients matters. And I think that the reason that that failed miserably is because we were not in a space yet where we were having a conversation about how if you can't do your job, I can't do my job either. And that our work is connected and our community is connected. And actually, every job that every single person performs is important for us to be able to actually perform as a society. You know, when we had the government shutdown, it was really about trying to put the final nail in the coffin of the GOP's rhetoric for over 30 years that federal workers were nameless, faceless bureaucrats, and that we don't need them, and we don't need all these agencies, and we don't need these government programs. But what happened instead? People saw people in their everyday life going to work, TSA agents, without a paycheck, sleeping in their cars not because they couldn't have a place to sleep or a way to get home, but because they weren't going to be able to afford the tank of gas to come back to work the next day because they were more committed to doing their job than the President of the United States. So I would just say that these issues in the workplace and the bargaining for the common good and connecting those fights is critically important if we're actually going to lift people up in their workplace. And it's not just about pay and benefits. People identify with the work that they do. And they have to feel like they have the resources and the ability to do a good job. And that makes them feel good about themselves. And I'll say one last thing about that. An economy where we exist, where we believe that it is right for 5% of the workforce, 5% of the people who want work to not have it, and that's a good situation, is a good thing, is a crazy way to think about a society. So we should also have a jobs guarantee, because why would we put people through that psychological warfare in their own experience when we have work for people to do, when we have bridges to build, when we have a whole infrastructure that we need to have in place so that everybody else can do their work and feel good about who they are. So I just think it's very, very important that we are identifying with the workers what's important to them in their workplace to be able to do their jobs and bargaining over all those issues and connecting that to other workers who are around them.
I'll go up there.
Hi, my name's Luke. I'm a sophomore at the college. My question is primarily geared towards Sara. You mentioned the importance of consensus earlier in labor. How can unions go about bridging political and even contract differences between leadership and its membership more broadly?
We simply have to decide to do it. So the union halls are where we can have these conversations, and where workers have been beaten down, It has taken incredible organizing to be able to take on the issues with the employer and fight back. And so if you just put this in terms of taking a strike vote, you have to take a strike vote, and that strike vote better turn out 90% for the strike. Otherwise, you don't really have the power to take on the corporation. And a lot of times that takes a lot of discussions. You can do the same thing by talking about the importance of government and the importance of who we have in office and what the issues are, and taking on issues like the climate crisis in our union halls to talk about how we're going to solve for this problem and what kind of policy do we need to have in place so that we can have good jobs and have good promise for our communities. So we simply have to decide to have the conversations and take those on, and not be afraid that having the conversations means that we're going to lose a position, because the only reason that unions exist is to lift up people. And if we're not doing that, then we're not doing our jobs, and we shouldn't exist.
I'm just going to add one thing. So, Los Angeles Times had a history of being the nation's most anti-union newspaper. There's a horrible incident 100 years ago where some ironworkers blew up the LA Times headquarters and killed a few people. But the LA Times was humongously anti-union, and with this new ownership about 7 years ago, Trunk, that was really draining profits, laying off a ton of people, shrinking coverage, closing bureaus. There was a movement to finally unionize the LA Times after like 140 years of not being union. And, there was a huge Twitter push to unionize. It seemed clear right away that maybe 55, 60% of the people were ready to unionize. So a lot of the staff were saying, let's hold a unionization vote. And then some organizers from the newspaper guild, now the News Guild, went to LA and said, hold your horses. Just because you have 60% ready to vote for a union, you still got to talk to the 40% who are not on board, because when you go into negotiations, you want everyone understanding what the union is about. You want not 60%, but maybe 90, 95% supporting unionization. So that delayed unionization by maybe 6 months. And it was very smart to do it that way, because they really had people understanding what the union was and what it was about. Then they had like a year-long, very difficult negotiation. But during that negotiation, the workers were really on board, 80, 90%, because they understood what was going on. It wasn't just pushed through 55% to 45%. So the union knew it's important to educate, communicate, and build consensus.
Why don't you go ahead?
Hi, Jay Gleason. Speaking of climate change, the AFA has at least given lip service to the Green New Deal and to United's Flight for the Planet. But it's not at all clear that plant-based fuels can replace jet fuels. Even under the best scenario, by 2050, there could only be a 50% reduction in conventional jet fuels, and we need a net zero to get below a 1.5 degree change in climate temperature. So I'm wondering whether the AFA is willing to urge people to fly less or fly not at all in order to help protect the environment. I mean, how far are you willing to go when it's a question of your jobs versus the question of the security of your jobs versus the security of the environment?
I just want to interject. So the Green New Deal people, have they presented proposals about what needs to be done for the flight attendants and the pilots and the baggage handlers who might lose their jobs as we
That's
move
exactly
towards
what I'm saying, and that's exactly what I'm wondering, and that hasn't been resolved, because your numbers on climate change for the flight for the planet don't add up. So, I mean, there's something has to give, and it may be your jobs, I'm afraid to say.
So I'm going to push back and just say that the way that we make change is by identifying the issue first. And frankly, we don't have a consensus around the science on the issue of the climate crisis. We might all agree in this room, but we don't have a belief that this is something that we should take on. We don't. We don't have an overwhelming consensus around that. So what our commitment right now is to say we are going to push back on the idea that people are spreading fear so that we don't talk about this issue. We're going to push back on that, and as flight attendants, we are going to say that it is not the solutions to climate change that are the job killer, it is climate change itself. Because if we don't do something about this, it doesn't matter if people choose to fly or not to fly, planes will not be able to take off when the tarmac hits a certain heat. We will continue to be bounced around the cabin with increasing severe clear air turbulence if we do not address this, which is a major occupational hazard for us. So our commitment is to continue to talk about defining the problem so that people build a consensus around the idea that this is something that we have to fix. And I really believe that when we do that, we are going to encourage American ingenuity like we have not seen in decades. And I believe that there are people who can create solutions that flying will continue to exist. But if we don't encourage that conversation and infuse that kind of money and political backing into that effort, we're never going to get to the solutions that solve it. But what I'm here to tell you is that we're going to continue talking about the problem because we believe very clearly that this is going to be taken out of our hands. It won't matter if we say fly or not. If we don't take this problem seriously, make it the #1 issue, and get all together with all of the brain power that we have all over this country and around the world to solve it.
We can do something now as far as that goes.
I'd like to add, sir, I'm all for the Green New Deal, but I see in your question that unions are too hesitant in fully embracing it, and a lot of union folks say, AOC, you might have a good idea, but you're not worried enough about the people, the coal miners, the people who work in gas-fired power plants.
Right.
I'm going to push back, she is.
The flight attendants
Right,
who might
right.
lose their
And
jobs.
we're going to talk, and we're going to talk, and it's going to get past the point where we can do anything. See, you want to talk instead of doing something right now.
Yeah, sir, you need a consensus you need to build a consensus to achieve what you want. And if you're alienating the workers, and I think you are in the way you're speaking, you're not going to achieve that consensus. And people who would generally be sympathetic to your position are not going to be on board with you. So it's important for environmentalists to work with worker groups to figure out a common solution. Bernie Sanders has a very good Green New Deal plan where he brought environmentalists and union folks together, and he says as we move towards a Green New Deal, which we should, fossil fuel workers who lose their jobs, we should guarantee 5 full years of pay for them, 5 full years of pension credit for them, guarantee health care for them under Medicare for All, and he's trying to make sure workers are on board with the Green New Deal, and you're kind of saying, let's just do it
Bernie
without
Sanders
them.
has his own private jet.
All right, I think maybe we should move on to another question. I'm going to go over here and then I'll get back to you. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Dana. I'm a public policy student here at the Kennedy School, and my question is a bit more lighthearted, but in Super Tuesday was yesterday, you touched upon it, but what are your thoughts on what happened on in the pro-labor, pro-union party, two very different kind of visions for the country? And I think based on what you talked about, I was struck yesterday watching Joe Biden's speech in that it did seem to me, as someone who's probably younger, that it was, let's go back to the middle class that never really existed speech, and talking about trade unions that have decreased and shrunk in size as opposed to trade unions that need to come into existence. So I was just wondering about your thoughts about yesterday.
So, I have a chapter in my book about labor's declining clout in politics, and I think, and unfortunately, too many Democrats haven't paid enough attention to worker issues, union issues, and Joan Williams, professor at UC Hastings, has a book saying, unfortunately, the Democrats have increasingly become the party of the professional class, lawyers, doctors, investment bankers, Hollywood folks, and not enough the FDR party of blue-collar folks. And so unions in this campaign clearly wanted candidates to speak up more for workers and unions than Hillary Clinton did 4 years ago. And so I think they like Bernie, they like Bernie's ideas, but I think a lot of them fear that it's going to be very hard for someone who describes himself as a socialist to defeat Donald Trump. A lot of them like Elizabeth Warren, and I think they're really ready to get on board, but her campaign really stalled. A lot of them also like Biden, but were worried that maybe he was too old, and they wanted him to be more pro-union, actively pro-union than Obama was. And now, I'm guessing a lot of unions are going to start lining up behind Biden, mainly because they, as much as they like Bernie and his ideas, they don't think he'd have as good a possibility of defeating Trump.
Yeah. So, I have my own personal preferences, but I would say that what Stephen said earlier is that every single one of the Democrats who are running in this primary have a better labor plan than we have seen in decades. So this is, if we elect a Democrat, labor's going to be better off on policy, period. We are at a place where we're facing an existential threat of our democracy going away. And so like I said earlier, I don't think it's just about this one election. I think it's really important that we are actually adopting the idea of not me, us into how we're thinking about beyond this election. So we have to keep organizing, we have to keep having strikes, we have to keep taking on the issues in the workplace, we have to keep building consensus, we have to keep building those conversations. And, we frankly have to beat Donald Trump because he is going to, he has shown that he's not even a patriot. He's not even willing to follow the Constitution or, accept the laws in this country. Or put the country first in that way. So that is a real problem because the Constitution is what gives us the basis for the right to have our unions and even the idea that we can have equal standing with our employers. So I think it's that fundamental, and as much as it's a lot easier with a president who is going to have policies that are going to be the farthest towards working people, it's easier. In a lot of ways, people remember struggle more than anything. And so I say welcome the challenge. And we just have to keep focusing on the fact that we have to build our unions and our labor movement. And we are not a constituency of the Democratic Party. We are our own movement in our own right with our own standing at the table. And if we can promote that idea, then it doesn't matter what happens in this election other than beating Trump.
And just to add, I was a reporter during the Reagan era, and I wrote about how anti-union Reagan's NLRB was. The Trump administration is far, far, far more anti-worker and anti-union than Reagan was. And I think a lot of unions realize not just we have to get rid of Trump to save our Constitution, but we have to get rid of Trump because his appointees, his judges, in the Janus case, are doing everything they can to destroy unions. So they want to pick a winner.
Yeah. All right, so we're running late, but we'll take one more question from you.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Question from the union. As you can, I'm Andrew Bergman, PhD student in applied physics here at Harvard, and as you can see, a member.
PhD student in what?
Applied physics here at Harvard, and as you can see, I am a member and organizer with the Harvard Graduate Student Union. Maybe unsurprising, I appreciate the framing that on the context that you gave us, Sarah. A little bit more critical, but I think accurate. Basically, at Harvard, we're seeing maybe what is a mature way of union busting, right? Where they are sitting at the table, but there are nonetheless tactics being used that make it very hard to actually arrive at a contract. There's regressive bargaining, rollback of a workload protection tentative agreement. There is threats of not rehiring students if they go on strike. Things that are not part of what we would like to see when somebody is sitting down in good faith to negotiate a contract. So thank you for that framing, very much appreciated. And so to connect that to what has been said multiple times now about what the Trump NLRB looks like, we're basically starting to ask now, and intentionality or not, what's happening is that the Harvard administration is using the fact that we can't really go to the NLRB right now to ask for anything, to have things be protected, our right to strike, issues at the negotiating table. The NLRB, we do not anticipate, and I'm sure no one does, that we'll be protecting that kind of behavior, regardless of the fact that there's obviously a whole rule being put forward to end this type of workplace negotiation at all. So we'll be fighting no matter what on this campus to keep pushing the administration hard. But what do you all think is sort of the right way to even conceive of what's going on, and how you battle when basically there is no the rules aren't there anymore. There's no ecosystem through which we can protect worker rights.
So you're right that these conditions are very difficult, because we are seeing that actually across the board in negotiations everywhere, that corporations know that they can fall back on the fact that the Trump administration is not going to hold up any of those rights, not going to keep the bargaining process going forward. We're experiencing that right now at Air Wisconsin, at Hawaiian Airlines. So organizing around this election is an important thing to do. Keeping organizing, talking with workers, continuing to organize yourselves so that you're ready in that moment to pounce. Because I will tell you this, as much as corporations have sort of used the fact that this administration is in charge and been willing to scapegoat on labor laws, we have another crisis coming now, and with the coronavirus. And all of a sudden, it's not so great that we don't have any structure or any backbone to be able to deal with this crisis. And all of a sudden, businesses are at risk because of it. So if you continue to organize, there is going to become a point in time where there is leverage to be had. And you have to look for that moment. And so we may not see it right at this moment, but you need to continue to organize, keep everybody engaged, and keep everybody watching, and wake up every morning and say, what is that moment where we are going to find that moment of leverage where we can force this university to get an agreement with us? And it will come. There will come that moment. And then the other thing that I would say is that we had to make a very painful decision during the bankruptcy to fight like hell to hang on to everything that we could, just so that we had something left to fight another day. And there are times when you have to make painful decisions about coming to an agreement simply because it is a step forward and a step higher on the mountain that you can climb higher later. So I would just offer both of those things.
So over the years, I've written about hundreds of labor disputes, and I'd say there are employers that play hardball and employers that play super hardball. There are employers with consciences and employers that are shameless and without a conscience. And you might disagree with me on this. I think Harvard is a place with a conscience, and you could really pressure places. You could pressure places that have a conscience in a way that will be vain. That won't with a.
That is reflected in the way that they are handling sexual harassment, discrimination.
Right,
here on campus,
I imagine
for
they're
instance.
concerned about public relations. Maybe you haven't made the public relations stink loud enough. Maybe you haven't brought in. I haven't been here, but
I think with their $40 billion endowment makes them feel like they can weather a PR nightmare as bad as it gets. And I actually don't think it's particularly meaningful to ask whether they have a conscience or not, because there is a bureaucracy in place that allows them to all look at one another and say, you know what, none of us are really doing this. This is just what's happening. It's very passive behavior. So I'm not weighing in on any of them as individuals. As an entity, they are not behaving as though they have a conscience. I do not agree with that.
That may well be right. But you have to hope that they do, because what are the tools that you as a worker have to pressure your employer? You could strike, you could do a corporate campaign, you could write op-eds, pressure, bring community support. It's maybe harder for you to bring community support because people already see you as an elite. So you have to, there are a lot of people of conscience in the Harvard community, a lot of professors, and fellow unions at Harvard, and you have to do the utmost to try to persuade Harvard to have a conscience, to have more of a conscience, however you want to describe it. Believe me, there are employers infinitely worse than Harvard that you could knock your head against the wall 100 times and you won't get to first base. But that they've sat down with you to talk, that they have the federal mediation, that's a big victory. It shows that you've gotten them to pay attention to you.
That's absolutely right. And I just want to note to Stephen's point about employers with a conscience and employers without. This is the 31-year anniversary today of the Eastern Airlines strike.
where those workers stood together and took on Frank Lorenzo, who rather than reaching an agreement with the unions, took the airline out of business. That is someone who really doesn't have a conscience, right? But the good news is that those workers stood together and did not allow that employer to continue to just erode. They stood up for the dignity of work, and they stood up for each other. And on that basis, I think that with Stephen's examples about what this university is, I think that you can find that conscience, and we can maybe talk about tactics afterwards, but you can find that, and you can encourage an agreement there. Because this is a different kind of employer than Frank Lorenzo.
All right. Well, thanks very much, everyone, and thank you too for sharing your wisdom.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we should just also note that we have the Harvard Trade Union program here in the house, and it is exciting that this school does have the longest history of training union leaders. So there's an area of conscience right there, and so yay! Thanks for being here.
That was great.